All right, welcome back to our latest explainer. Today we're taking a chronological journey through what is, without a doubt, the greatest and bloodiest American battle of World War II, the Battle of the Bulge. We're going to break down exactly how a massive, surprise German offensive briefly shattered the Allied lines and how the unbelievable defense that followed became a defining moment of the 20th century. Let's get right into it. 81,000. Take a second to let that number sink in. That staggering figure represents the immense American casualties, killed, wounded, or missing, that make this the costliest single battle in U.S. military history. To put that into perspective, how did such massive losses occur so late in the war when Allied victory seemed almost inevitable? Well, to answer that, we need to rewind a bit and look at the exact conditions that allowed this battle to happen in the first place.
Section 1. A dangerous overconfidence, the deceptive quiet of the Ardennes.
So you might be wondering, how on earth were the Allies caught completely off guard? We have to look at the setup in the winter of 1944. Following the rapid breakout from Normandy, Allied supply lines were stretched dangerously thin. The High Command, including General Eisenhower, decided to use the heavily forested, really difficult terrain of the Ardennes as a quiet rest area. They basically placed fatigued, battle-weary troops there to recuperate, right alongside completely inexperienced replacement units. It's a classic historical lesson, right? Never assume your enemy is beaten just because they're quiet. Because the reality just across the German border was entirely different. The Germans were secretly building a massive strike force of over 400,000 men and 1,400 tanks, literally right under the Allies' noses.
And the way they pulled this off is honestly fascinating. The Germans managed to completely blind Allied intelligence, but not with some advanced technology. Nope, they used brilliant, low-tech deception. They maintained strict radio silence, relying almost entirely on landlines to avoid intercepted messages. Get this, they even issued charcoal to their troops instead of wood for cooking fires. Why? Simply to cut down on smoke that might be spotted from the air. Combine that with a heavy autumn overcast that completely grounded the superior Allied reconnaissance planes, and the dense Ardennes Forest perfectly concealed the largest gathering of German armor in the latter half of the war.
Section 2. Hitler's desperate gamble, splitting the alliance. Now, this wasn't just some localized counterattack, not at all. Adolf Hitler envisioned a wildly ambitious blitzkrieg. The goal here was to pierce those thinly held American lines, race all the way across the Meuse River, and capture the vital Belgian port of Antwerp in just 4 days. By doing this, the Germans hoped to trap 4 entire Allied armies without supplies, basically forcing the Americans and British to negotiate a separate peace. I mean, even his top generals thought this was way too ambitious. Actually, scratch that, they thought it was practically impossible. But the orders went forward anyway.
Visualize the map of Europe in your head for a second. The official military term for this operation is the Ardennes counteroffensive, but the press coined it the Battle of the Bulge. Imagine the front lines stretching and physically bulging inward under the intense, sudden pressure of the German advance. It created this massive, nose-like salient 50 miles deep into Allied territory. Section 3. The Surprise Assault. December 16, 1944. That deceptive quiet of the forests, it was violently shattered. Just imagine the sheer terror here. At 5:30 a.m., a 90-minute artillery barrage from 1,600 German guns rained down on those unsuspecting, freezing American troops across an 80-mile front. This massive bombardment was immediately followed by infantry and armored assaults charging right out of the thick fog. Because the Allies were completely blind to the buildup, many frontline units initially just thought it was a minor, localized skirmish. They had no idea what was actually coming. To add to the chaos at the front, the Germans launched Operation Greif. Commando Otto Skorzeny led a task force of English-speaking Germans dressed up in American and British uniforms, driving around in captured jeeps behind Allied lines. They altered road signs, cut communication wires, and just caused massive paranoia everywhere. Security got so unbelievably tight that American military police set up checkpoints all over the place, grilling troops on American pop culture to prove who they were. General Omar Bradley himself was actually detained briefly over a geography question because the MP interrogating him didn't know the actual capital of Illinois. No way, right? But despite the total surprise and the utter chaos, the German timetable was instantly derailed right at the northern shoulder of the attack, a place called Elsenborn Ridge. Here, vastly outnumbered and mostly untested American defenders from the 99th Infantry Division, fighting right alongside the 2nd Division, stood their absolute ground against Adolf Hitler's hand-picked elite SS armor.
This heroic stand forced the German tanks to reroute through narrow, muddy secondary roads. It created a fatal bottleneck that slowed their entire offensive down to a crawl.
Section 4. The Siege of Bastogne, surrounded in the snow.
Now, we have to talk about Bastogne. It was the hub for 11 hard-topped roads winding through this really rough Ardennes terrain. Basically, whoever controlled Bastogne controlled the movement of the armies. By December 21st, the Germans had completely surrounded the town, trapping the U.S. 101st Airborne Division and elements of the 10th Armored Division inside. General Eisenhower actually viewed this whole German offensive as a strategic opportunity to draw the enemy out of their defenses and crush them in the open. But for the men trapped inside Bastogne, freezing, lacking winter gear, short on food, and restricted to just 10 artillery rounds per gun per day, it was nothing short of a claustrophobic nightmare.
On December 22nd, with the American perimeter rapidly shrinking and the situation looking entirely hopeless, the German commander sent over a formal demand for the immediate surrender of Bastogne. So, how do you think the trapped Americans responded to this overwhelming pressure? Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, the acting commander of the 101st Airborne, read the demand and just uttered a single word of complete frustration. His staff typed it up and delivered it right back to the Germans. Nuts. Just one word. It was a legendary reply that perfectly encapsulated the sheer defiance, grit, and resilience of the American defenders. They absolutely had no intention of giving up those crossroads, serving as a powerful reminder of how sheer human grit can sometimes halt an unstoppable military machine in its tracks.
Section 5. The tide turns. The skies clear.
The siege really clamped down on the 21st. But once that heavy winter fog finally lifted on December 23rd, the entire course of the battle was rewritten in just 3 days. On the 26th, the lead elements of General George S. Patton's Third Army, having executed an unbelievable rapid 90-degree pivot in the dead of winter, smashed through the German lines from the south and finally broke the siege of Bastogne. When those skies cleared, the Allies brought their ultimate advantage to bear. Allied P-47 Thunderbolts and heavy bombers absolutely filled the air. They dropped crucial supplies to the freezing troops in Bastogne, but more importantly, they unleashed hell on the German supply lines. With the return of Allied air superiority, the German panzer divisions were practically paralyzed. You have to remember, the German plan heavily relied on capturing American fuel to keep pushing forward. Without it, and with their own supply lines bombed to rubble, they were literally starved of the gasoline they desperately needed to ever reach the Meuse River. At this point, the hunters became the hunted. Erasing the Bulge was a brutal, freezing slog through the snow, and it required meticulous coordination. Patton's forces pushed up from the south, while Montgomery's forces drove down from the north. These strategic, coordinated pincers slowly squeezed the German salient until the two Allied armies finally linked up at the town of Houffalize in mid-January, eventually forcing the surviving German units all the way back to their original starting lines. We really must pause and reflect on the human cost of saving the Western Front, because it was absolutely staggering. There are the 81,000 U.S. casualties we started with, alongside British losses, and up to 100,000 German casualties. The German army poured the very last of its elite reserves, armored vehicles, and aircraft into this massive offensive. The irreplaceable loss of those men and machines essentially wiped out Germany's final armored reserves for the entire rest of the war. So, I want to leave you with this final thought for our explainer today. We've seen the unbelievable heroism, the massive strategic blunders, and the sheer human tragedy of the Ardennes. But consider this. By throwing their absolute last offensive resources, their best tanks, and their most seasoned fighters into the freezing forests of Belgium for a gamble that ultimately failed, did the Axis High Command accidentally ensure the swifter collapse of their entire empire? Something to think about. Thank you so much for learning with us today.